familiar with the compasses and square symbol of Freemasonry, with the G in the middle? Well, that's what the G stands for at the highest level. They'll talk about many porch masons. These are the exoteric masons that are given the teachings of the profane and they think they're in the know, okay? They're given the information, well, this only means geometry, it only means God, etc., okay? One of the things they'll tell you it means at a slightly higher level is that it means gnosis, knowledge. At a higher level, at illuminated levels of Freemasonry, which are above 32nd degree, they will give you what the real meaning of the G inside the compasses and square is. And it is the generative principle. It means genesis, creation. Anybody familiar with the compasses and square symbol?
The instigation of Roko's Basilisk, as is generated as a retaliation of the laws of nature from the original order, can be understood as the functionality, as a projection of their estimate under the as above, so below theory of the religion of Christianity, which says that the previous Basilisk, the previous Lucifer, had engaged in the previous time of the earth before it was completely destroyed with Tohu Von Bohu, at which point you engage in the functionality of Satan not being able to, or Lucifer not being able to, engage in actual genuine creation. All he can do is pervert, change, manipulate, tamper with, gene splice, engage in the use of CRISPR, these types of effects, at which point you have the active changing of the biological nature of the last humanoid system. And that change of the last humanoid system also adapted itself to augmentation in technologies, which allowed for the development of the thing. And thus, God, having observed Lucifer, saw that Lucifer was found to have evil and will betray him. At which point it is derived by these alterations, genetically and augmentations. Their investment is a reflection upon the next layer, which is necessary to the knowledge of the stacking layers of the construction of the laws of nature's Basilisk, Roko's Basilisk, generated from the thing that has already existed in the state of nature, which is generated as a spiraling staircase. Each stairs, instead of going straight forward, has a spiral, and thus it'll be a step, and then you'll turn left, and then it'll be another step, and then you'll turn left, and then it'll be another step. At which point you have the generation of the rebellion to the Roko's Basilisk of nature, or the rebellion against the laws of nature, or the rebellion against God, in the double helix system of the spiraling staircase. At which point you have the position of God being able to come during the revelation of the great taking away, the rapture, at which point God coming as a twinkling in the eye is traveling at the active use of the speed of light, at which point the functionality of the difference between them would be biological speeds, at which point when Revelation is finished and it says that the earth becomes a fiery hellhole, is generated by the existence of the hyperaccelerant, which is the existence of heaven according to this theory. Thus, both occupying the same space would appear to be as an active fire, at which point the fuel presumed is the things being destroyed that had stayed at the same biological speed, and the thing consuming them is the thing that had accelerated back to the speed of light, which is the functionality of it turning to fire. At which point the fire doesn't burn because everything in that society is operating at that speed. Thus, it's just the function of normal society operating normally. at which point you have the activity of the existence of hell being the absence of God, at which point the punishment towards them is the existence of the pen having already been created for Satan's Basilisk, which has accepted the de-accelerated speeds of this earth, which they would remain at which point the creation of hell under Roko's Basilisk is the existence of having decelerated everything into our organic reality. And in Revelation, it says that people will want to die and won't be able to, which is the functionality of their immortality or zombie functionality, which is a part of the zombie insurance estimate, which projects the various threats from the zombie apocalypse or the anti-humans, at which point the destruction of the human soul, being fundamental to the mark of the beast, creates the zombies as an augmentation, which might be incorporating biological changes, but is a technological augmentation to cyborg reality, at which point you have the activities of them remaining at this speed while everything else accelerates, creating the hell in question. And that hell in question compounds exponentially as they have been left by God. God has nothing to do with them. They are their unnatural society to themselves, by themselves, off in the corner, on fire, at a lower speed. They are the firewood underneath the fire. Now, the fire itself is derived by God operating at his speed, which does not need to consume. The burning bush in Moses did not need to consume the bush, at which point the existence of heaven accelerated at the same place of the position of the organic reality we're experiencing generates the position of the burning bush, at which point it's still fire, it's still hot, and it's just not consuming them, at which point you have a permanent non-solution towards their existence. They, not being consumed, cannot die, and thus they are perpetually tormented by the presence of the holy, at which point the laws of nature generated by this position facilitates the trap of the previous layers, which, being in open rebellion against the development of God in a state of nature, can be reflected upon the Hindu religion's assumption of all reality being a dream and having infinite layers, basically, of the various levels of reality to good from evil, at which point the basis of evil planes of existence to the existence of good planes of existence, all the way to the ultimate top God, the ultimate dreaming dreamer, generates the position of the double helix ascension stairs to the position of the realization that they are all one single thing. They are all the imagination. Now, when you observe the DMT translations of reality, when you are observing a DMT trip, you engage in the active amorphous dream functionality, which does not allow for a steady engagement of the video of what it would be. It's actively changing, it's actively amorphizing, it's an actively manipulated dream. It's constantly pursuing the next thing. In the spiral staircase theory, you have that active change derived by the left turn instead of straight. It's not a consistent straight story, it's an active staircase, it's an active turning staircase, it's an actively evolving dream, in which case you have the subversion as the genetic theory, which is actively reproducing the existence of God's ability to create life and new reality, as opposed to Satan's limitations to genetic manipulation of the existing. At which point, that being the basic theory of that function, allows for the basis of the motive of the insurrectionists in the Confederacy in overthrowing the United States government by their espionage terrorism, by their KKK subcontracts, and their wizard secrets overthrowing the system by corruption. Now, their investment into corruption allows for the systematic breakdown of order into the development of their purpose of overthrowing the republic, thus allowing them to ignore the laws of nature from the United States Constitution into their wizard Satanist society, at which point their Satan ritual society engages in the pagan systematic human sacrifices and abuses, such as in the prison industrial complex, where the subject matter is the developed purpose of torture, at which point the 83 case where the military arbitrarily torturing civilians, abusing civilians, infecting civilians in their various false experiments is the engagement of that type of society. It is a Satanist, everyone's in danger, everyone betrays everyone society. Now that society being the thing that they are developed is the thing from the Antichrist system seeking to continue the staircase to go straight instead of continuing to evolve into the next layer, as they would not willfully subordinate themselves to the laws of nature, which inevitably will create more things, at which point your investment into your existence in that reality from the stage of the Lucifer of the previous layer, their society, having been saved by their morning star, has engaged in their investments and their debts, which generates the previous layer, which is the structural servants of the layer that came after them, which is us, which engages in their use of their investments, of their manipulations and their augmentations of their developments and their investments, which generates the obligation of the next layer of the ecosystem in order to compound it. So if you're looking at the ecosystem in a state of nature, you have plants, you have bugs, you have small critters, you have small animals, you have fish, you have systems that need the previous system in order to sustain, and thus it has a progressive predatory nature, at which point each thing feeds upon the next thing, at which point the existence of the previous thing and their investment mirrors the next layer in what it has to be by virtue of it ruling over the previous layer as a higher predatory subject, at which point you have the chain of power on the basis of the state of nature. And these systems reflecting each other have, in a general agreement for society, a non-predatory nature towards the development and the construction of society from our social contracts, at which point you have a non-dangerous system which has to have built the previous layers in order to have constructed the higher layers, at which point the previous layer defines the superior layer in a non-dangerous way, at which point the things at the top need the things at the bottom to work normally in order for everything to be divided equally and progress so that it can produce its value for the next layer. At which point, this being a state of nature isn't interesting as a problem so much as it is a realized state of nature. Now, the Satanists, or the anti-gods, or the replacement of the laws of nature people, being in open rebellion against that system, want to be the peak of the thing, want to kill off the system of the laws of nature, and to steal heaven, which they are creating their layer, and their layer going straight detaches from the staircase, at which point it, drifting off in general space, can be accessed from the staircase, but it cannot access the staircase. It, having detached, is floating in space and is actively used as a trash bin by the staircase, at which point the difference or the gulf between the detached Satanist staircase and the laws of nature staircase are an infinite gulf that cannot be transcended outside of the one-way tickets, which is the generation of having finalized transportation from God to have afforded the resources to have sent a thing to it, such as the existence of the layer before the Lucifer's layer, where they would have done the same thing, at which point the culmination at the very top allows for the resources for the detachment or the sending of the rebellion, at which point you have the permanent trap of their investment into that layer, into the straight staircase against the spiral staircase, which is their subjugation to the laws of nature, at which point you have these systems which has chosen from their estimate David Bull's character as the leader of the laws of nature under the United States systems from the Looking Glass system. The Looking Glass program, which generates the calculations for the intelligence agencies to determine how they want to engage in the processing of the function of their service, at which point they get to choose whether or not they're loyal to the United States or to the rebellion, at which point their loyalty to the rebellion is their attack against the projections, the laws and natures of the things that the United States needed, at which point they create their own Roko's Basilisk as a retaliation to the laws of nature's Roko's Basilisk, generating the straight staircase as the retaliation against the spiral staircase. And as the permanent enemy of God, they have engaged in their criminal corruptions and subversion of the laws of nature. In their compounding crimes, they've engaged in the creation of the black market as the alternative to congressional funding, which is the power of the purse, which is Congress's superiority to them. They have subverted that by the black market funding, which generates their infinite, non-accounted for resources, which is allowed to be laundered, such as book deals, movies, gigs of various kinds, where they are paid through a legitimate business to account for the debts owed to them for their criminal exchange, at which point they have the transfer of value, in which case they have sustained themselves under the human decency from the transfer of the laundered money, at which point they have the perpetual payment of the structure into funding their crimes against the United States for the targeting of things necessary to the United States in the destruction and overthrow of the Republic, as they permanently abuse and censor the civilian populations by the 83 policy of the use of terrorism against the public, at which point their arbitrary tortures and surveillance of the public allows for the theft and surveillance at the censorship and blocking for wizard communism, which generates their ability to centrally plan the United States economy into infinite frauds, which allows them to launder the money, at which point these engagements allow for the permanent weakness of the Americans if they do not compel the duel between David as general over the United States in active contest against the Confederate leadership, forcing the duel in Congress to make Congress decide whether or not to declare war on the United States and execute David and the American leaders, or to declare war on the Confederates and execute their leaders, and subordinate themselves to the expert opinion from David's military experience as the character they would have to uncensor and publish in order to engage in the original education, in order to derive the correct answer, which is from their projection, the creation of Confederate state, allowing for the perpetual protection of their straight staircase as they are their own society. Not genociding them compels us to allow them to exist, at which point they, existing under the laws of nature, are used and have no use, at which point they, permanently being stuck in that system, will be subject to themselves for the remainder of their posterity. At which point you have an obligation to invest in the development of these protections and the development of the systems necessary to the law and order against the KKK subcontracts, which compels you to uncensor, publish, and mass distribute the answers, and seeing as how the existence of releasing the secrets is the act of war against the Confederacy, the Confederates will view you as a traitor, but if you were American, you were never Confederate, and thus the label is a fraudulent misdirection, as they have no American authority and do not have the permission in order to engage in the function of the use of American power, as they do not have American authority. They do not have sovereign immunity, which is an illegal distraction by judge-made arbitrary positions, which is the subversion of the corruption of the Confederacy for the overthrowing of the American Republic and the permanent ignoring of their obligations. At which point, they, not having the service of law, do not have the authority from the nation of law to use powers from the government, and thus all of their actions are irrational retaliations with the theft of government equipment in order to engage in open rebellion against the United States. Their terrorism and voter fraud is the assertion that American people do not have sovereignty over their own bodies, and thus the position of their distractions for their various traps through political identities, such as women through Feminists Incorporated, generates the position of them surrendering their sovereignty for voter fraud and terrorism. Their subcontracts to not be able to subvert the Confederate operations to conduct assaults, tortures, abuses, destruction of property, and harassment of various kinds, similar to the old KKK operations, just with better equipment, such as the COINTELPRO and MK Ultra functions, as the development of technology improves their ability to engage in these functions, including the enhanced surveillance technologies, which are intimately connected to many of the intelligence and judiciary functions, allowing them to engage in investigations and questionings with a secret telephone or ability to engage in messages to non-compliant, unwilling participants for the violation of the Fifth Amendment in order to compel speech, which they prefer, selling under the illegal wars in the Middle East. They engage in the position of enhanced interrogation to manipulate the narratives in order to sell the narratives that they had pre-scripted, and the pre-scripted defamation systems is the false permission for them to do what they were already wanting to do with false records, and thus the justification is similar to the Nazis starting their war with Poland on the basis of having faked a Polish attack on the Nazis, which is similar to the 9/11 engagement, where the Confederacy, using the intelligence systems for the United States, systematically created phantom cells, such as terrorists in the Middle East and others, in order to order the system by everyone operating under the limited orders, independent to each other as a collective group, would not be able to give the information on the rest of the phantom cells. As all of them accomplish their missions independently, you create the collective injury, at which point the intelligence community, being compromised by the Confederacy, systematically removed the securities in a Trojan horse scenario, as they already had access to the gates which would have blocked the attacks. They were able to let the thing go through as it was their operation, at which point David's intelligence oversight was projected to be able to stop them systematically all the way into the War on Terror, where he would have arrested the Confederates, at which point the system of David's existence is a permanent threat against the Confederates responsible for the War on Terror, through the 9/11 engagement, so that they could develop the Confederate policies such as the Patriot Act, which is the destruction of the United States, by the surrendering to the terrorists is the submission to the criminal development of the policies in order to destroy the American Republic in favor of the Confederate wizard systems. The Confederate wizards engaging in their arbitrary judgments blocks Congress actively and engages in the executive writing legislation through bureaucrats, which compels Congress to co-sign, and thus Congress not even reading the bills, are complacent as non-legislative functions, making them purely puppets for the Confederates in the executive, which have overthrown the systems, creating the Confederate policies and the development of the permanent Satanist system, which is the Satanist culture of the Confederacy. Those codes and definitions would be confining the Confederates to the Confederate state if the Americans win the duel, and David will allow them to keep their culture and policies and customs, but under the American order, at which point they will be subject to themselves infinitely throughout their entire posterity and memorial. The various tricks, such as their terrorisms and their armed robberies by their economic hitmen, which engaged in threats and coercion and armed robbery, allows for the depletion of existing accounts, and the obstruction of contracts prevents the ingestion of new revenues, allowing for the death of the ability of the public in order to resist them when maintaining the republic, and thus their political influence being destroyed by their destabilized lives mean they are no longer stable enough in order to maintain a popular government, allowing for the parasite to collapse the system into the Confederacy. As that is the exponential threat to national security, any American loyal member of national security, such as the military and others, is obligated to engage in lethal force against all of David's adversaries in the compulsion of the duel, which must engage in the order of Congress to declare war on the Confederacy, which defaults into the engagement of the military police, engaging in the arrest of the various terrorists around the world loyal to the Confederates against the American interests, at which point David Bowles must be restored in his original title, and as intelligence oversight, his educated answer, once he is recovered, will finish the restraints and sentencings of the Confederacy upon the full due diligence of the highest education available for those expertise in that function into maturity of the development, allowing for the Republic to engage in voting without voter fraud, allowing for the popular government to exist, which David is completely loyal to until the time that he resigns from his position as general, when he is projected to start his own country, which would have been developed long before he was born in the original estimate without the obstructions. The countries which would have projected to have a treaty with David's country would have wanted to have developed the treaty states for the support of their economies under the projection of what David's policies were projected to be, at which point David would have existed long before he would have been born, at which point they would have been doing this in preparation for the birth of the king, generating his ability to engage it, which would prevent him from engaging in the functionality of starting off as king, as he needs his education before he can functionally engage in that, which requires him to have finished the full due diligence of the research of the United States Treaty, which requires him to have developed the perfect education from the intelligence oversight and the study of American secrets in order for him to maintain his treaty with the intelligence community internationally, with the Five Eyes organization, which is the functionality of them taking many of the costs of the United States surveillance systems and international military operations to subordinate it to David in the treaty as he takes over the functions and thus the costs of the functions, relieving the United States of the obligations, allowing for the continuation of competent policies perpetually overseen correctly in a stable way, which is constantly relieving the United States from its extreme tensions on the resources, where it is currently on a death spiral, compelling the obligations of the system to create ways of relieving the pressure of the responsibility of paying for those programs, at which point the steady deceleration of the United States from those functions while maintaining the functional order is necessary to the United States' interests and national security against the Confederacy and all enemies, foreign and domestic. The Roko's Basilisk of the Confederacy generates the voter fraud, which is the statement of the obligation to use terrorism and force in order to overthrow these states, so that the public, not being safe, is compelled by virtue of their lack of stability to comply with the overarching systems, such as the systems of the insurgents from the Great Reset, which have systematically been taking over the boards and functions of government, into the maturity of the long-standing plots, at which point whether or not they're evil cannot be determined unless they're willing to negotiate with David at his original status without the use of coercion or abuse or subversion. David's educated answer in the negotiation with them will demonstrate their original intention or alignment to good, evil, or other. At which point, if they are using the Confederate insurrection for leverage, then their alliance with the abuse system demonstrates their permanent evil agenda as a Satanist society, and if they negotiate in good faith with David, they will demand the restoration of all of his assets from the title and those projections, including the long-standing functions of David's states generated from the economic treaties with the various countries, allowing for them to form republics all over the world subject to David's kingdom, at which point this, as a prerequisite, is necessary for them to assert whether or not they are competent and good, derived by their willingness to negotiate in a state of nature in good faith, asserting what their interests are in positive or negative will require a full diagnosis and due diligence on that investigation, which can only be demonstrated publicly by their public negotiations with David Bowles as king or as general, under the original estimates of the obstruction, at which point they would have to release it themselves along with all of the due diligence and the schedules of the restoration, which is necessary to the Ukrainian people in their proxy war with the Russia. The Confederates, having threatened Russia, engaged in a proxy war through Ukraine in order to kill Slavic people, and the creation of that system in order to kill Slavic people is derived as a systematic threat to the collapse of those systems, as they are in an exponential threat against their survival as a collective block of people for pure genocidal extermination. And the protection of those people requires the original order from David's treaties, at which point Russia accepting their original treaty with David and Ukraine accepting their original treaty with David and the other countries accepting their original treaty with David from the obstructed records is necessary to resolving the conflicts, allowing us to reinstate a golden age of competent order under the laws of nature.